On the evening of May 25, 2016, an incident occurred at Fayette Mall in Lexington, Kentucky. That is how the official story begins. Plain, administrative, almost apologetic in its simplicity. According to police statements released in the days that followed, a shoplifting-related altercation escalated into a brief fight involving several young men inside the mall. Officers were dispatched. The situation was contained. 6 arrests were made. No serious injuries were reported. And yet, for reasons never adequately explained, the response that night bore no resemblance to any ordinary disturbance. By nightfall, more than 100 police cruisers had converged on the Fayette Mall complex. Every entrance and exit, serving not just the mall itself, but the surrounding restaurants and parking structures, was sealed. No vehicles were permitted to leave. No pedestrians were allowed to pass through the cordon. It would later become clear that nearly the entire active police force of the city had been mobilized. Those inside the mall were kept there for hours. Roughly 30 minutes into the lockdown, Kentucky state troopers arrived from outside the city. They established checkpoints at the mall entrances and began questioning everyone who attempted to exit the building. Employees, shoppers, teenagers who had come only to eat dinner or pass time. Particular attention was paid to anyone who had been near the food court, and anyone who admitted to taking photos or videos that evening was strongly encouraged, often while being watched, to delete them on the spot. Just after midnight, the mall was finally cleared. 6 people were taken into custody. None were charged. The story, officially, ended there. Unofficially, 5 people never left Fayette Mall that night. Their cars remained in the parking lot until they were quietly towed. Their families would spend the remainder of that year searching for answers that never came. No bodies were recovered, no blood, no weapons, no evidence of violence, at least none that authorities ever acknowledged. 2 of the missing worked at a small, locally owned jewelry store near the food court. The other 3 were believed to have been nearby when the incident occurred. Castle Jewelers. The interior of the shop was found in a state that investigators privately admitted did not resemble the aftermath of a robbery, a riot, or any kind of struggle they could name. Structural damage inconsistent with blunt force. Fixtures gone without trace. No sign of forced entry. No sign of exit. And then, quietly, the investigation stalled. By the end of 2016, public attention had drifted elsewhere. The mall reopened. Shoppers returned. Complaints focused less on unanswered questions and more on the inconvenience of the police response. Fayette Mall became just another place again. But that night did not exist in isolation. While Lexington police were occupied with the mall lockdown, the Bluegrass Airport diverted all incoming and outgoing flights until morning, citing air traffic control malfunctions. Power outages rolled across neighborhoods on the western and southern edges of the city, flickering on and off in patterns utility crews could not explain. Residents reported strange cloud formations in the sky. Low, resonant sounds that did not resemble thunder. Horse farms west of the city would later report sudden deaths among otherwise healthy animals, discovered in shattered barns come morning. None of these events were officially linked. Most were forgotten within weeks. I did not forget. I was inside Fayette Mall when the lights went out. I was sitting in the food court with an old friend, someone I had known long enough to trust my life to his instincts, when the atmosphere of the place changed in a way I still struggled to describe. Not with panic, not with noise, but with the quiet wrongness that settled over the room like pressure before a storm. We felt it before anything happened, before the power failed, before the sound, before the dark appeared where it should not have been. And though I have replayed that night more times than I care to admit, I still do not know whether what followed was something that entered our world, or something that was already there, waiting for the lights to go out. I had not planned to be at Fayette Mall that night. I rarely went there, even then. Malls had always struck me as places designed to keep people moving without thinking, drifting from light to light, storefront to storefront, insulated from weather and time. But earlier that evening, I'd been visiting an old friend of mine, Thomas, who was living in a rented house just across Nicholasville Road. He had invited me up from Danville to fill in for a tabletop game he had started with classmates from the university. The sort of thing that sounds better in theory than in practice. When the session ended early and the others filtered out, Thomas suggested we grab dinner at the mall and catch up properly. I remember hesitating, not because of any premonition, just a dull reluctance, noise, crowds, plastic food. But it had been over a year since we'd spoken face-to-face without a buffer of mutual friends, and the suggestion was made casually, without weight. So we went. The Fayette Mall food court was exactly what you would expect. A wide, angular space just inside one of the main entrances, ringed by cramped restaurant fronts, pizza, pretzels, fried things with interchangeable names, surrounding a broad cafeteria-style seating area. Fluorescent lighting, tiled floors. The low, constant murmur of conversation and background music engineered to go unnoticed. The doors to the parking lot were on the western side of the room. Opposite them, on the eastern edge, a hallway led deeper into the mall proper, flanked by storefronts with glossy windows and soulless names. We split briefly to get food. Thomas returned with 2 slices of Sbarro pizza. I settled for rice from a Thai place that advertised itself as authentic in the same way all such places do. We chose a small table near the back of the food court, positioned so we could look down the eastern hall while we ate. People watching. That was the real entertainment. We talked about unimportant things. Classes, mutual acquaintances, plans that never came to pass. I remember urging him to leave town more often, to get out into the real world, to trade plastic environments for rivers and woods and air that wasn't recycled. It was pleasant. And that is what troubles me most about the memory. I cannot tell you exactly when I knew something was wrong. Not because I am withholding it, but because the feeling arrived without a clear beginning. No sound, no flash. No moment that could be pointed to later and named as the start. Thomas would later admit, quietly, years afterward, that he felt it too. A subtle shift in the atmosphere, something intangible, as if the room itself had grown attentive. Our conversation drifted off without either of us acknowledging it. At some point, we both found ourselves staring down the eastern hall in silence. I do not know how long we sat that way. A minute, perhaps longer. Other people seemed affected as well. Some hurried their pace, glancing over their shoulders as they moved away from the corridor. Others slowed, hesitated, scanning the space as if searching for a threat they could sense but not yet see. It reminded me of animals in a clearing. Ears turned toward a sound beyond hearing. The wrongness grew. By then, the sun had fully set. The last natural light had faded beyond the walls of the mall, and the space relied entirely on its artificial glow. The overhead bulbs in the hallway ahead of us seemed to dim. Not flicker exactly, but dull, as though their output were being quietly throttled. Then came the sound. A low rumble, distant enough to be felt before it was heard. More vibration than noise. I remember thinking of thunder, though the evening had been cool and clear, wrong for a storm. A chill crept through me, sudden and physical, as if cold rain were seeping through my clothes. I shivered. Thomas shifted in his chair. I think he was about to suggest we leave. Several groups nearby already had. Not in panic, not loudly, just with measured speed, gathering their things and moving toward the exits with focused intent. We waited a second too long. The hallway ahead of us was lined with shops on both sides. Clothing outlets, a cookie place, a makeup store, and at the far end, nearest to where the corridor bent out of sight, a small local jewelry shop, Castle Jewelers. Its sign jutted out from the storefront, decorated with a little castle motif that seemed almost mocking in hindsight. I remember noticing the lights in that sign first, waning, waxing, struggling against some unseen instability in the power supply. And then, without warning, they went out. Not just dimmed, gone. The interior of the shop followed a heartbeat later. What replaced it was not darkness as we understand it. It was something else. The shop did not simply go dark. I need to be clear about that. The mall itself was still lit at that moment. The hallway lamps were dim but present. The glow from the food court behind us still spilled weakly across the tiled floor. People were still visible. Shapes still had edges. But the interior of Castle Jewelers vanished. Not into shadow, not into the absence of light. It was as if the space behind the glass had been painted over with something impossibly dense, a depthless black that swallowed reflection and refused illumination. The windows no longer behaved like windows. They no longer reflected the mall lights or the people standing before them. They reflected nothing. It was not a void in the sense of emptiness. It felt occupied. Those who would later speak, quietly in places where their words could be safely dismissed, would struggle for language. Blacker than black, albeit deeper than shadow. A color that did not belong to the visible world. It drew the eye, not like a bright light, but with the same insistence. I could not look away, even as some instinct screamed that staring was a mistake. Around us, conversations died. Footsteps slowed, then stopped. Every remaining person in that hall and the food court beyond was looking at the same place. The darkness did not move. Then the sound went away. Not faded, not lowered, gone. The ambient hum of the mall, its ventilation, its distant music, the electrical whisper of a public space, was extinguished as cleanly as if someone had thrown a switch. In its place came that low rumble again, nearer now, resonating through bone rather than air. And then the power failed entirely. The lights in the hallway snapped off. The food court behind us dropped into murky shadow. This darkness was ordinary by comparison. Phone screens immediately flared to life, small white beams cutting weak tunnels through the gloom. Voices rose, cautious and restrained. Nervous laughter from those farther away, unaware of what had happened at the far end of the hall. But no one near Castle Jewelers spoke. It felt wrong to be heard. Thomas raised his phone. I remember the sudden flare of its flashlight startling me, not because of the brightness, but because of the sense that attention had been drawn where it should not have been. Other lights joined his. Not many, just enough. The beams reached down the hallway. We could see the remaining shoppers standing frozen where they were, half-formed silhouettes at the edge of the light. And nearest the jeweler's open doorway stood a woman later identified as Jill Oakley. She was facing the storefront. Beside her, no, towering over her, was something that did not resolve properly in the light. At first, it appeared as a single leaning line, a vertical smear of darkness darker than the surrounding dark, like a two-dimensional stroke painted onto the air itself. It bent low over the woman, nearly twice her height, featureless and impossible to place in space. It had no face, no eyes. And yet, without any doubt, we knew it was looking at her. It did not move at first. It simply existed, radiating a quiet, suffocating malice that pressed in on the chest and made breathing feel like a deliberate act. The woman stared up at it, frozen, her eyes catching the phone light and reflecting it back in wide, wet points. Slowly, so slowly that time seemed to stretch around the motion, the line thickened. Limbs emerged. Two elongated arms slid from its center, smooth and boneless, unfolding like growths rather than appendages. They spread wide and low, positioning themselves on either side of the woman with terrible patience. At their ends, clusters of tendril-like fingers unfurled, fluid and restrained, as if savoring the moment before contact. No one screamed. No one moved. We all knew, without speaking, that nothing we could do would matter. The thing coiled. And then it struck. Its arms snapped tight around her body with sudden, horrifying speed. The sound that followed was small, a muffled compression, a brittle crunch. But in the absolute silence of the mall, it echoed like a gunshot. The breath was forced out of her all at once. Then she was gone, pulled into the thing's core as if into a crevice in stone. Her body disappeared impossibly into the dark line, which straightened as the limbs retracted in a single smooth motion. For a moment, it stood there again, featureless and still. And then it turned, not with eyes or head, but with intention. I felt it searching. Behind it, the darkness within Castle Jewelers shifted, and more lines began to emerge. The thing did not rush. That was the worst part. It leaned forward, the bottom of its elongated body splitting and reforming as if it were testing the ground beneath it. It moved with a deliberate, almost careful precision, placing itself as if the floor were unfamiliar or fragile. Each motion was smooth, economical, devoid of urgency. It was hunting. Behind it, within the impossible dark of Castle Jewelers, more of them slid into view. At first one, then another, then several more, emerging like vertical scars opening in the air. They did not all take the same shape, but they shared a sameness that made my stomach drop, a family resemblance of form and intent. Lines of darkness darker than darkness, bending and unfurling, orienting themselves toward the frozen observers in the hall. I lost count almost immediately. My mind recoiled from the task. Somewhere behind me, someone sobbed quietly. The sound was small and thin, as if even grief understood it should keep a low profile here. No one ran. No one shouted. We were trapped not by walls or force, but by the certainty that movement would be noticed. I remember thinking, absurdly, that if I stayed still enough, if I became part of the background, it might pass me by. The low rumble returned. This time, it was close. It rose from beneath the floor, from behind the walls, from inside my chest. It grew in volume and pressure until it felt less like sound and more like an approaching physical weight. The lights of the phone screens trembled in shaking hands. Then the storefront collapsed. Not outward, inward. The front of Castle Jewelers caved in on itself as if pulled backward by an unseen force. Glass, drywall, metal fixtures, all folded and vanished into the darkness beyond the doorway. The air in the hallway rushed violently toward the shop, whipping hair and clothing, stealing breath from open mouths. I felt my ears pop as the pressure shifted. Loose debris, paper cups, plastic trash, fake leaves from decorative plants, was yanked from the floor and hurled into the void. Strands of dead fairy lights tore free from a nearby awning and followed, snapping and sparking briefly before disappearing. The shadow things were pulled with them. Whether they resisted or not, I cannot say. They stretched and warped as the force took hold, their elongated forms bending and thinning until they were dragged back into the blackness from which they had emerged. Several people closest to the storefront stumbled forward, dragged a step or two by the sudden pull. Someone fell. Hands scrabbled against tile. And then, just as abruptly as it had begun, it stopped. The rumble cut off mid-resonance. The suction ceased. The darkness was gone. Where Castle Jewelers had stood was now a ragged ruined cavity. Concrete and drywall were scoured raw. The ceiling above sagged and cracked. The foundation below was exposed, gouged away as if by massive claws or pressure no tool could replicate. There was no trace of the store, no counters, no display cases, no merchandise, no bodies, no blood, just absence. For several seconds, no one moved. Then the sounds of the mall returned all at once, distant alarms, confused shouting, the whine of emergency lighting kicking on somewhere far away. People began to cry openly now. Some ran. Others sank to the floor where they stood. Thomas grabbed my arm. I remember that clearly. The pressure of his fingers. The fact that his hand was shaking as badly as mine. We did not speak. We did not look back. We moved with the others, guided by emergency lights and shouted instructions that came too late to matter. When uniformed officers finally reached us, their faces were tight and pale, their eyes darting constantly toward the darkened hall behind us. They did not ask what we saw. They asked where we had been standing. Hours later, after questioning that felt deliberately vague, we were allowed to leave. We were warned, politely, firmly, that discussing what had happened would not be helpful to anyone. I understood the message. In the days that followed, I searched for proof, photos, videos, anything. If any existed, they were erased or confiscated before they could surface. What remained were rumors, fragments, and the steady insistence from authorities that nothing extraordinary had occurred. 5 people were listed as missing. 6 arrests were quietly dropped. The store was sealed off, rebuilt, reopened. Life resumed. But something had come through that night, and something had been taken. We were not allowed to leave Fayette Mall for a long time after that. Uniformed officers herded us away from the food court and into broader corridors where the emergency lights still functioned. The mall, once loud and thoughtless, had become a maze of hushed voices and controlled movement. No one was permitted to wander. No one was permitted to return for belongings. We were counted, again and again. When we were finally escorted outside, the scale of the response became clear. Police cruisers filled the parking lots in dense rows, their lights painting the buildings and asphalt in silent pulses of red and blue. Barricades blocked every exit. State troopers stood at checkpoints, faces impassive, rifles slung casually but deliberately. I had the distinct impression that whatever had happened inside the mall was no longer the priority. Containment was. Each of us was questioned before being allowed through the perimeter. The questions were strangely imprecise. Where had you been standing? What stores had you visited? Who were you with? What time had you arrived? They did not ask what we saw. When someone volunteered information, when fear loosened their tongue and they began to describe darkness, or shapes, or sounds, the officer would interrupt gently, steering the conversation back to logistics. Anyone who mentioned recording video or taking photos was asked, calmly but firmly, to produce their phone. Those devices were checked. And if something had been captured, it was deleted. Watched. By the time Thomas and I were allowed to leave, it was well past midnight. The air outside felt wrong, heavy in a way I could not explain. Even the night seemed subdued, as though sound itself had been dampened. In the days that followed, the official narrative hardened quickly. A fight, a disturbance, an overreaction perhaps, but nothing more. 6 arrests, no charges, no danger to the public. 5 missing persons reports were filed quietly. Their names appeared briefly in local news, then slipped to the back pages. No press conferences followed, no appeals. Just silence, punctuated by families asking questions that received no answers. But the mall was not the only place affected that night. While Fayette Mall was under lockdown, the Bluegrass Airport diverted all flights to Louisville and Cincinnati, citing malfunctions in its air traffic control systems. Incoming planes were turned away mid-approach. Outgoing flights were grounded until morning. Power outages rolled unevenly across the western and southern neighborhoods of Lexington. Entire blocks went dark, only to flicker back to life minutes later, then fail again without pattern. Technicians could find no consistent cause. No storm. No equipment failure that fit the data. Residents reported the sky behaving strangely. Ring-shaped cloud formations appeared west of the city, hovering briefly over open pasture before dissipating like ripples on water. Low, resonant sounds were heard throughout the night, deep and rhythmic, unlike thunder, unlike machinery. And in the horse farms beyond the city limits, something else happened. In the days that followed, several prominent breeders reported sudden losses among their stock. Healthy, valuable animals were found dead in their stalls without warning or injury. Others had panicked violently, breaking through barn doors and fencing, as if desperate to flee something unseen. Veterinarians offered explanations that satisfied no one. None of these events were officially linked. Each was treated as an isolated anomaly, an inconvenience, a curiosity. And then, as people tend to do, Lexington moved on. I tried to do the same. Thomas did not. We spoke only rarely after that night, and never easily. When the subject came close to Fayette Mall, he would grow distant, evasive. Once, years later, he admitted that the feeling we experienced in the dark, the hopelessness, the sense of being diminished, had never left him. He was not alone. Others who had been nearby that night would later die under circumstances that raised no official concern. Accidents? illness, quiet endings that drew no attention. Thomas himself did not live to see the next decade. I do not believe that was coincidence. It was not the violence of what we witnessed that stayed with us. It was the certainty that something had crossed a boundary, and that we had been close enough to feel its gravity. That something vast and indifferent had brushed against our lives and left an imprint that time could not erase. Even now, when the lights flicker unexpectedly, or a room grows too quiet, I feel it again. That pressure, that attention, and I cannot shake the fear that whatever opened that night did not close as cleanly as we were told. Time did what it always does. It dulled the edges, not the memory itself. I still see it with painful clarity, but the urgency with which the world seemed to care. Weeks passed, then months. New stories replaced old ones. Outrage found fresher targets. Fayette Mall returned to being a place people went to kill time. The incident became a footnote, an oddity occasionally mentioned on obscure forums or late-night call-in shows, where it was spoken of with a tone that made it safe to dismiss. A hoax, a misunderstanding, a mass panic. A story for people who wanted to believe strange things happened in ordinary places. I stopped correcting them. What I did not stop feeling was the weight. In the aftermath, those of us who had been closest to the event shared a peculiar affliction. Sleep became unreliable. Dreams, when they came, were shallow and brittle, snapping apart at the slightest disturbance. Waking hours felt flattened, as if the world had lost depth. A quiet despair followed us. Not dramatic, not loud, just persistent. Thomas described it once as a sense that something essential had been taken. Not happiness, not hope, but the assumption that reality was stable, that the ground beneath us could be trusted to remain solid. After Fayette Mall, that assumption was gone. We were careful people afterward. We avoided crowds. We noticed exits. We flinched at power flickers and unexplained sounds. Some of us became obsessive record keepers, saving articles, screenshots, scraps of testimony in case the story ever resurfaced. Others did the opposite. They buried it. They refused to speak of that night even in private. I do not blame them. To think too deeply on it was to invite that feeling back. The sense of being observed by something vast and patient, something that did not care whether it was remembered. Thomas never recovered. He lived outwardly, a normal life for a while, finished school, found work, laughed at the right moments, but there was always a distance behind his eyes, as if some part of him had stayed behind in that darkened hallway. When he died, the circumstances were unremarkable enough to draw no scrutiny. They never are. The world is good at absorbing loss without comment. I often wonder whether the others who vanished from that night were truly taken in body, or if we who remained were simply taken more slowly. The city never acknowledged the broader pattern. The airport malfunction was written off. The power outages were attributed to infrastructure issues. The animal deaths were quietly compensated and forgotten. No connective tissue was ever officially drawn between these events, but I cannot believe they were unrelated. Something happened over Lexington that night, something that strained systems, bent routines, unsettled animals, and erased a space from the inside out. And whatever it was not constrained by walls or by the brief attention of law enforcement. Sometimes, in quiet rooms, I feel the echo of that low rumble again, not as sound, but as pressure, a reminder of depth, of scale, of how thin the membrane is between the familiar and the impossible. I've learned not to look too closely at dark storefronts after hours. I avoid standing near doorways when lights flicker. I tell myself these are habits, not superstitions. But I know better. The most unsettling thought is not that what happened at Fayette Mall could happen again. It is that it may already have happened elsewhere. Unnoticed, misfiled, forgotten. We like to believe that if something truly terrible occurs, it will announce itself loudly, that alarms will sound, that explanations will follow, that closure will be provided. That night taught me otherwise. Sometimes the world simply opens, and then it closes again, leaving behind only absence and the people who remember standing too close when it did. There is a temptation, when confronted with events like this, to search desperately for meaning, to ask what it was, why it appeared, whether it chose that place, that night, those people, for a reason we could ever hope to understand. I have spent years resisting that temptation, not because the questions are unimportant, but because they offer a comfort I no longer trust. Meaning implies intent. Intent implies structure, and structure implies that there are rules we might learn, boundaries we might avoid crossing. What happened at Fayette Mall felt ruleless. The people who vanished were not reckless. They were not seeking forbidden knowledge. They were eating dinner, working late shifts, passing time in a space designed to feel safe through familiarity. They did not summon anything. They did not open a door. They were simply near it when it opened. That is the thought that lingers. We build our lives on the assumption that danger announces itself, that it wears recognizable shapes, follows patterns, obeys narratives we have rehearsed since childhood. Monsters are supposed to lurk in abandoned places. Disasters are supposed to come with warnings. That night violated those assumptions. The mall was clean, bright, ordinary, a place parents dropped their children without fear, a place that sold comfort and distraction by the square foot. And for a brief span of time, it became something else entirely, not corrupted, exposed. I believe now that the true horror of that night was not the violence, brief as it was, but the revelation it carried. That the world we move through daily, its buildings, its routines, its systems, rests on something thinner than we are willing to admit. A surface. And beneath that surface, there are depths we were never meant to glimpse. The response afterward only reinforced this truth. The speed with which the narrative was flattened, the eagerness to reduce something unmanageable into a list of arrests and inconveniences, the quiet understanding among officials that some things are better left undefined. It was not a conspiracy born of malice. It was fear. Fear wearing the mask of procedure. I no longer believe that silence is always imposed from above. Often, it rises from below, from ordinary people who sense that knowing more would cost them something they cannot afford to lose. Sleep. Stability. The ability to walk through familiar places without imagining what might be waiting just beyond perception. We tell ourselves stories about resilience, about moving on, about how forgetting is a kindness. But forgetting has its own consequences. The cost of pretending that nothing happened is paid quietly, over years, by those who remember, by those who flinch at shadows, by those who feel a weight settle on their chest when a room grows too still. I am one of those people. I do not claim to understand what came through that night. I cannot name it, classify it, or place it within any comforting framework. I only know that it was real, and that it left marks no investigation could catalog. Perhaps the most unsettling possibility is this: that nothing went wrong at Fayette Mall. That the systems worked exactly as they were designed to. The disturbance was contained. The evidence was removed. The public was reassured. Life continued. The anomaly was not the event. The anomaly was the brief moment when the surface cracked enough for us to see beneath it. If that is true, then there is no lesson that will keep us safe. No behavior that guarantees avoidance. No warning signs we can reliably heed. Only chance. Only proximity. Only the thin mercy of not being in the wrong place when the world briefly forgets to pretend. I do not share this account to convince you. I share it because memory is the only thing that resists erasure. And because some doors, once noticed, cannot be unseen, even after they have closed. There is a particular kind of fear that fades quickly. The kind that startles, spikes the heart, then burns itself out. It belongs to loud things, to spectacle, to moments that announce themselves clearly and end just as clearly. What happened at Fayette Mall did not belong to that category. What lingered was quieter, heavier, a pressure that did not demand attention but waited patiently for it. The sort of fear that integrates itself into routine until it no longer feels like fear at all. Only caution, only fatigue, only the sense that something fundamental has shifted slightly out of alignment. I think now that the most damaging aspect of that night was not the violence, nor even the disappearance of 5 people. It was the realization that reality does not owe us coherence. We live as though the world is governed by consistent rules, as though causality is a promise rather than a convenience. We assume that danger scales with warning, that anomalies are rare and localized, that if something truly impossible were to occur, it would do so in a way that leaves behind undeniable proof. But the incident at Fayette Mall suggests otherwise. It suggests that extraordinary events can happen quietly, briefly, and leave behind almost nothing tangible. That they can be mistaken for disturbances, filed away as inconveniences, and absorbed by systems whose primary function is not truth, but continuity. The mall reopened. The lights were fixed. The store was rebuilt. The city resumed its rhythm. And in doing so, it taught a lesson far more unsettling than any monster ever could. That normalcy is not restored because danger has passed. Normalcy is restored because it is necessary. We rely on familiar spaces, malls, airports, neighborhoods, not just for convenience, but for psychological stability. They reassure us that the world is predictable, navigable, safe enough. When those spaces fail us in ways that cannot be explained or contained, the response is not always investigation. Sometimes it is erasure, not out of malice, but out of preservation. I no longer believe that those in authority that night fully understood what they were dealing with. I believe they understood only that it could not be integrated into the world as it was. And so, like any system under threat, they minimized, compartmentalized, and moved on. The cost of that decision was not paid publicly. It was paid privately. By those who could not forget. By those who felt the shape of the absence where something had been removed. By those who learned, too late, that safety is not a guarantee but a statistical mercy. If there is any insight to be drawn from the Fayette Mall incident, it is this. The boundary between the ordinary and the unthinkable is not a wall. It is a membrane, thin, flexible, invisible when intact. And when it ruptures, even briefly, it does not announce itself with answers. It leaves behind questions that cannot be resolved, only endured. Perhaps that is why stories like this persist, despite efforts to dismiss them. Not because they promise revelation, but because they validate a suspicion many of us carry quietly, that the world is stranger than it appears, and that our understanding of it is provisional at best. I do not expect belief. Belief is not the point. Memory is. Because memory resists the smoothing force of time. It preserves the rough edges, the discomfort, the unresolved weight. And in doing so, it stands as the only defense against the quiet lie that nothing happened. Something did happen. And the fact that it left so little behind may be the most disturbing thing of all. What endures after an event like this is not fear in its dramatic form, but a recalibration of how one understands reality. The Fayette Mall incident forces a confrontation with an uncomfortable possibility. That the structures we depend on, physical, social, psychological, are not designed to protect us from everything, only from what they can name. When something emerges that cannot be categorized, systems default not to truth, but to stability. Narratives are simplified, anomalies are isolated, memory is diluted. This is not a failure of individuals, but a feature of collective survival. Societies persist by maintaining coherence, even when that coherence requires omission. The danger lies not in what happened, but in how easily it was absorbed. If the event had been louder, bloodier, more cinematic, it might have demanded reckoning. Instead, it slipped through the cracks between categories. Too strange to prosecute, too brief to study, too disruptive to acknowledge. And so the burden shifted to witnesses, to those who carry the residue of an experience they cannot externalize or resolve. This is the quiet cost of erasure, not ignorance, but isolation. The knowledge that something occurred outside the bounds of explanation, and that there is no language, official or otherwise, capable of holding it. In that sense, the Fayette Mall incident is less about what appeared in the dark, and more about what happens afterward, how easily reality reasserts itself, how quickly unanswered questions are reframed as inconveniences, and how fragile our confidence becomes once we realize that the world does not always behave as a closed system. If you had been there, if you had seen something that could not be explained, recorded, or safely discussed, what would you have done afterward? Would you have spoken anyway, knowing it might cost you credibility, stability, or peace of mind? Or would you have done what most people do, accepted the official version even if it never quite fit, and learned to live with the discomfort of unanswered questions?